Well, I mean, I never answered the door anyway, so good luck subpoenaing me.
Hello, fellow netizens, and welcome to Scandalous Games, the show where we take a closer look at video game-related controversies. I'm Kevin Impellizeri, and I do the research and share a story of a video game-related controversy to my friends.
Hi, my name's Phil, and today I'm more of a newbie than ever.
I'm Andy Hunter, longtime gamer and a long history with today's subject matter.
And I'm Kate. I've written software for over a decade, but not the kind where we capture little monsters and give them fun accessories.
I'm really excited for this episode, a bit of a change of pace that we've had for some of our heavier subject matter as of recently. So instead of covering neo-Nazis, climate change, and possible war in Taiwan, instead we're going to talk a whole bunch about Pokemon today. Specifically, we're going to talk about a genre of Pokemon games that are developed by fans. We'll go into a bit of their history and the culture behind them. So what are people's experiences with Pokemon?
I've been into it since Gen 1, as insiders will know what I mean there. So back in 1999 or so, I saw my brother watching the cartoon show, when I would get home from high school. And then he had the Game Boy games, and he let me borrow one. And I've been a fan ever since. And I've played nearly every mainline Pokemon game that has come out since then.
So I know that there is a popular proclivity to track down and repatriate these monsters back to wherever they came from, and not just some of them, but in totality.
Yes, we don't need to dress it up as repatriation. We got to catch them all in order to have the cutest cockfights the world has ever seen.
They're still sponsored by Tecate.
I believe, Andy, I believe the term you're looking for might be re-education.
Oh, there we go.
What about you, Kate?
Yeah, similar to Andy, Gen 1, I was familiar with them. My parents were pretty strict about various television we watched as kids, and ever since I rebelled and watched Sailor Moon when I was like 7, they really didn't like us watching anime, so we didn't watch the show. We did have the cards. My sister was really into them, and then I think my real exposure to it was playing Pokemon Yellow on the Game Boy, and that was when I really got into it, and that's been most of my exposure to Pokemon in general. I've never seen the show, I've never seen the movies, but I've played a lot of the games, and I have really fond memories of, what's the one with Dialga as the big one?
Diamond.
Yeah, that was my favorite one, probably. I was a grown-up. I was at a conference, and I was in my hotel room at night after the conference and trying to finish it up.
Sweet.
Yeah, I also have a long history with Pokemon. I first got into it with Red and Blue. My absolute favorite is Silver. I like the Gold Silver generation. I think it made so many great improvements. I liked a lot of the lineup in that. I was really into the anime at that point. I watched the first 2 movies, and then I kind of took a break from Pokemon with the 3rd gen, so the one that was in the Game Boy Advance. Then I got it back into it with Platinum and played a bunch of Black. And then for my Switch, I got Shield, and I played that for a bit, and then I kind of put it down. And the real big problem with Pokemon is that if you put it down for a long time, it's really hard to pick it up again. So I might be tempted to start it over again. I also, after doing a bunch of the research for the show, I picked up Silver again, put it in a new battery, and started a whole new game. So it's been a lot of fun. I've had a good time with this series.
Oh, that's where you've been all week. Sorry.
So with that, does anybody want to offer a brief summary of what Pokemon is? We've got a video game newbie here, so if we were explaining this to Phil, how would we explain this?
Andy, you want to tag team this?
Sure, yeah. So you play as a character somewhere between 10 years and 13 years of age.
Irresponsibly unsupervised. Go on.
Yes, and you live in a world where there are magical creatures called Pokemon, and you can capture them and make them join your team as protection, and they can then help you capture other Pokemon. So you have a team of 6. You go throughout the land, basically defeating 8 different Pokemon gym leaders, and also a criminal mafia enterprise that always gets involved in the story.
An underground syndicate that is somehow weirdly controlling this world. Go on, sorry.
Yeah, and then in the end, you challenge and hopefully defeat the Pokemon League, becoming the Pokemon champion.
I will also add, these monsters get critically injured on the regular. However, crucially, they never die. They simply pass out, and you have to waddle your way to various rest stops with people with pink wigs and sexy nurse uniforms who help keep them from being passed out. You can then buy candy for them. I think, right? They eat candy. I mean, that's all they eat. Yeah. And so then, yes, you must defeat the mob syndicate with these unkillable zombie monsters that eat candy.
Okay, so if they're revived by candy, maybe it's just that they passed out due to a diabetic coma.
Maybe. I'm sorry, Kate.
Rub some honey on their gums. Come on. Sorry.
I will take one issue with your description there. Nurse Joy is a natural pink head.
Oh, okay.
Those are not wigs.
Okay. I was just going by what Halloween Adventure tells me, so thank you for clearing that up.
My entire inner erotic life depends.
Okay. Oh, you really need the drapes to match the curtains. I understand.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Or no, the drapes to match the rug or whatever. We can move on.
So I have another follow-up question. So when the animals are captured, do they join your team against their will, or do they do it willingly?
I never asked. Andy, did you? I never asked.
Well, the games frequently pay a lot of lip service to the idea that you are working together, that you are partners, though there are certain limited circumstances in which Pokemon can disobey you. And that's if you get a Pokemon from a trade. So we totally overlooked this. A crucial part of the Pokemon formula is each game is released in pairs. So going all the way back to the original Red and Blue here in the States, Red and Green in Japan. That's right. I'm showing my cred right away. They each had like 70% or so of the Pokemon. And so what you had to do was be friends with somebody who bought the other game. And then you would connect your Game Boys via the Game Boy Link cable so that you can trade Pokemon from one game to the next. Like, oh, I've got a Magmar and you've got an Electabuzz, and they're not in each other's games.
Did you just make that up, or are those real names?
Those are both real names.
Those are real.
Wow. Okay.
You're going to think we're making stuff up before the end of this episode. I will let you know if I'm making anything up.
Thank you.
So you can catch Pokemon and trade them to one another's games. And if you don't meet certain in-game criteria, then the Pokemon that you receive from trades might disobey you.
Okay. And then you figure out a buyout with that Pokemon and the Pokemon's agent. And then they're free to join any team as long as the playoffs haven't started, right?
Yeah. And then they announce it on TikTok and everyone's happy. Yes.
Oh, okay. All right. This is starting to make more sense to me.
Okay.
Yeah, I forgot about the Poke arbitration minigame.
It's helpful if you can draw real world parallels to the fiction world. Yeah.
Yeah. Just trust the Poke process. Okay.
Oh, okay. All right.
So yeah, thank you, Andy and Kate. So just to jump off, Pokemon is a turn-based RPG series developed by Game Freak and released by Nintendo. The player assumes the role of a trainer of monsters called Pocket Monsters, or Pokemon for short. These monsters come in different types, such as water, fire, or grass, and they have strengths and weaknesses against other types. So for example, fire is strong against grass is strong against water is strong against fire. Through the course of the game, players gain new Pokemon by catching them in the wild in devices called Pokeballs, trading them with other players or NPCs, or acquiring them through game-specific or real-world events. And as in traditional RPGs, Pokemon gain experience points and levels through battling other Pokemon, using up to 4 moves of various types in a turn-based format. Players can have up to 6 Pokemon, as Andy said, in their party at a time, whom they train to level up, gain new moves, and evolve into more powerful forms. And so with that intro out of the way, allow me to introduce you to a young boy called Red. Growing up with his mom in Pallet Town in the Kanto region, Red had a dream. He wanted to be the very best, like no one ever was. Fortunately for him, he happened to live in the same town as the renowned Pokemon expert Professor Oak, who brought Red into his lab one morning and offered him a Pokemon who would accompany him on his journey across Kanto. Whether Red chose the grass-type seed Pokemon Bulbasaur, the fire-type lizard Pokemon Charmander, or the water-type tiny turtle Pokemon Squirtle has been a subject of intense historical debate. Although for what this humble historian's opinion is worth, it was always Bulbasaur.
Yes, Bulbasaur is a very good pick for the original game because Brock, the first gym leader, has rock-type Pokemon. Grass is strong against rock. And then Misty, the second gym leader, is a water-type gym. Grass is also strong against water. So basically, Bulbasaur could be considered like easy mode. Squirtle is sort of medium mode. And then Charmander would be hard mode because Charmander then is weak against the first 2 gyms.
Fire-type can be really tricky to navigate against most of the games I've noticed. Like I usually end up picking either the grass or the water type for the reasons you just laid out, Andy.
Question. Are all of you talking about the game? Also, I think you all said you would preface when you were making stuff up.
Help me understand, Phil, what parts didn't make sense? Pulls out a phone book.
There was a person with the name of a color, and then there were 3 words which were clearly made up that evolved into other words. And then I just kind of lost context for what was happening.
So yeah, we got Red. He's got his new Pokemon. His new partner in hand, Red began a grand adventure to catalog every Pokemon in Kanto and battle his way to the top of the Pokemon League. Along the way, he gained new Pokemon and trained them in into a powerful team. He battled other trainers on his way to defeating the region's 8 gym leaders, followed by the Elite Four, and finally his rival, who happened to be, in a surprise twist, Professor Oak's grandson, to earn the title of Pokemon League champion. During his quest, he also thwarted Team Rocket, the criminal organization bent on stealing other people's Pokemon, and battled the genetic Pokemon Mewtwo deep in the Cerulean Cave. They weren't all victories, however. Red could never figure out how to move that damn truck parked in Vermilion City. Kids, ask your parents.
Well, actually, my uncle who worked at Nintendo told me that there's a certain glitch that can make the truck move, and Mew is underneath the truck.
Andy, I'm new to the podcast with you on board. Do you really? I don't know who works at Nintendo.
No.
Okay.
No, it's just,
okay.
Didn't every school have
Yeah.
an uncle who worked at Nintendo?
I was just about to
You
get real
said
excited.
you would tell me when you were making stuff up, and you didn't. I don't know.
You know
He's
what?
thrown everything into question now.
That's what life is like sometimes. You gotta figure it out yourself with no one but your wits and either your Bulbasaur, your Squirtle, or your Charmander beside you.
This is so confusing.
But we have destroyed objective reality for Bill. Alright, so the first 2 Pokemon games, Pocket Monsters Red and Pocket Monsters Green, released for the Game Boy in Japan on February 27th, 1996. And it didn't take long for the monster collecting RPG games to take Japan by storm. Red and Green, along with a third version called Pocket Monsters Blue released later that year, sold 1.04 million units in 1996 and 3.65 million units in 1997. Their success inspired tons of related media, including Pokemon-themed merchandise, manga and anime adaptations, and a card game best known today for rampant collector speculation and hilariously scamming Logan Paul. Pokemon's success didn't stay contained in its native Japan for long, and Nintendo prepared Western adaptations for international sale. Pokemon Red version and Pokemon Blue version released in North America on September the 28th, 1998, followed by Australia a month later and a year later in Europe. As in Japan, the games were an instant smash hit, selling 4 million units in 3 months in North America alone, on the way to becoming a worldwide commercial and pop culture success. Since then, Pokemon has remained one of Nintendo's flagship properties and one of its most prolific franchises. As of this recording, there have been 9 mainline sets of games, also known as generations or gens, to say nothing of the countless spin-offs and crossovers with other franchises, or the library of manga and anime adaptations. For example, the Pokemon anime consists of over 1,200 episodes and 19 movies. All of this has made the franchise's mantra to catch them all pretty daunting in recent years, as the National Pokédex, the complete catalog of all existing Pokemon, currently has 1,008 entries as of this recording. Despite people's love for the mainline games, it's hard to deny that across 27 years and 9 generations, the formula has become a little stale. Regardless if you're playing Pokemon Red on the Game Boy, Pokemon Scarlet on the Switch, or something in between in the Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, or Nintendo DS or 3DS, the games tend to follow the same beats. You're a kid in a small town, and you meet a Pokemon professor who gives you your choice of a grass, fire, or water-based starter. You capture and train Pokemon and build your team. You take on a rival who periodically challenges you during your journey. You thwart the plans of some evil organization bent on doing something nefarious with other people's Pokemon. You battle trainers and type-specific gym leaders. Eventually take on a group of elite trainers, followed by a climactic battle with a champion who's usually your rival, on your way to being crowned as a true Pokemon master. Now, many games iterate on the battle mechanics. For example, Ruby and Sapphire introduced double battles, where you battle 2 Pokemon at once. X and Y added Mega Evolutions, where Pokemon temporarily evolved into an even stronger form. And Sword and Shield brought in Dynamaxing, where Pokemon could suddenly become gigantic. However, the main experience has been generally the same across all generations. Now, to Nintendo and Game Freak's credit, some of the more recent entries have been taking more chances to mix things up. For example, Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, which were remakes of Pokemon Red and Blue released for the Switch in 2018, introduced light open-world elements, which were expanded in Pokemon Sword and Shield, and Pokemon Legends Arceus, which came out in 2019 and 2022 respectively. Meanwhile, Scarlet and Violet, the 2 newest mainline Pokemon games of this recording, broke from tradition by releasing in a surprisingly unpolished state, full of hilarious glitches and bugs.
The most profitable media franchise in human history, everybody.
Wait, that's true?
I'm pretty sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. I mean, they set up a great framing device, right? If the catchphrase is "gotta catch them all," then like every time that they introduce anything new, and some of the later generations, they started getting super lazy. Like they're just kind of looking around the office, like the Remote-mon, or I have a television remote in my hand right now. Like whatever was within reach, they're just gonna make a monster out of that.
Jumping off that, like in Black and White, I want to say it is, there is one Pokemon that is literally an ice cream cone, and one that's literally a bag of trash.
Yes, there are. And I feel like the Pokemon community as a whole is like, some of them love these Pokemons. Like, yeah, Pokemon have always looked ridiculous. It's fine for them to be this kind of on the. I mean, in the very first generation of Pokemon, there was a Pokemon that looked like a Pokeball.
Right. Sometimes you just want to get home by 5:30, There's one that looks like a sword too, I remember, right? I know there is the sword one.
Yeah, there's a sword that didn't come out until I think X and Y.
It's just a sword with eyes, right?
It evolves into a pair of swords, and then that evolves into a sword and a shield.
Phil, we're not making this up.
Yeah, they're running out of ideas. The level of consistency, to some would argue the point of stagnation, has inspired some fans to take it upon themselves to spice up their Pokemon playing experience. Take, for example, the Nuzlocke Challenge. Is anyone here familiar with the Nuzlocke Challenge?
No.
I've never done one, but I believe the way it works is you play through a regular game, but with the self-imposed rule that if any of your Pokemon faint, you actually treat them as if they've been killed in battle, and you like permanently release them. That's my very basic understanding of what a Nuzlocke challenge is, which I think then oftentimes people, I believe, using like ROM hacks, I believe then people will also do like a randomized Nuzlocke playthrough, which I assume just changes what Pokemon are available in which sections of the game, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah, that's a pretty good description of it. So the Nuzlocke Challenge was developed by comic artist Nick Franco for his series Pokemon Hard Mode. A Nuzlocke run is a playthrough of a mainline Pokemon game with two key rules. The first is that the player can only catch the first Pokemon they find in a given area. And the second part is what you talked about, Andy, which is that if a Pokemon faints, they are considered dead and must be released. Some people will just stick them in a Pokemon box, but the whole thing is that once they fainted, they cannot be used anymore. And that losing all of your Pokemon is a game over and you need to start all over again. The run got its name from Franco's starter, a Nuzleaf he drew with the face of the character John Locke from Lost, which looks equal parts hilarious and terrifying. Over time, the community added new rules to Nuzlocking, such as naming every Pokemon you catch to forge a greater bond with them, limiting the number of items you can use, and not using traded Pokemon or legendaries.
I have a question in terms of the naming them, because I named every Pokemon I've ever caught just because I do that. I tend to panic name them and give them stupid or meaningless names. Does that invalidate the challenge or like?
It's you just name them something. It doesn't matter what you name them.
So I can give them stupid names and then I don't care if they die. Got it.
Well, the whole purpose of that is so that you create a stronger bond, not that you care less about them.
Right, but if I named them something like, Stinky or something, then I don't care if Stinky dies.
But I guess by the spirit of the challenge, you shouldn't name them all Kill Me.
Kill me or I hate you, all one word,
Other fan-created challenges include single-type or single Pokemon runs, so just trying to beat the game with just a Magikarp, or say beating it with only Ghost-type Pokemon. There's also runs where you can't use any items, or no faint runs where you have to beat the entire game without losing any Pokemon. There's also the Professor Oak Challenge, where you try to complete as much of the Pokedex as you can before competing in a gym battle. So, Phil, what that means is as you acquire Pokemon, you build up this encyclopedia called a Pokedex. And a full Pokedex is when you've caught every known Pokemon in there. So with the Professor Oak Challenge is basically when you get up to a gym battle, before you do that battle, you try to catch every Pokemon in the area that you possibly can. And then on top of that, you try to evolve them as far as you can, that you can actually go in that part of the game. And so the idea is to have as much of the Pokedex completed as possible before you reach certain sections of the game. I found a 2020 thread from a Pokemon-related message board where people discussed the merits of the Professor Oak Challenge, and some common words and phrases that came up to describe the experience included tedious, and quote, an exercise in frustration, end quote.
Yeah, I can buy that. I mean, if you're trying, like the starter Pokemon that you get typically will reach its final stage at level like 36-ish. And if you're given it at level 5 and you're just grinding against level 1 to 5 Pokemon, getting all the way from 5 to 36 is gonna, take forever. I can see why it would be incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, that's the level people are trying to mix this game formula up.
So I just want to interject, I find that a little interesting. You're right. It's like they're trying to make this more interesting or more challenging. Pokemon on its face is just kind of a job. It's like it's more a job than a game after a fashion. Once you get to a certain point in the middle, it's just a lot of grinding and leveling up characters. And so, I mean, I don't know if this is a way to maybe insert your own fun. Like, Kevin, why did people do this?
Again, they're trying to make their own fun. They're trying to find something within the formula of the game that changes it up. So like the whole thing with the Nuzlocke run is that the reason it really took off in the fan community is because it made every fight tense and exciting, because at any moment you could have one Pokemon who's carrying you throughout the game and they could just be swept out. Or they could be a situation where like you have this one Pokemon that you did not expect to do anything for you who then just suddenly becomes like your hero. And I've come across a bunch of message boards and people posting about like for someone that creates a really personal and a very visceral kind of experience with the game, that like I made it through the Elite Four on this one particular one, or was like hanging by a thread, or it got swept out and I was able to do this. Like it's a way of creating a kind of unique experience for every player. That's what people seem to like about the Nuzlocke challenges.
That makes a lot of sense now. I mean, I'd never done the Nuzlocke challenge, but thank you for telling me that, because that makes a lot of sense. Because one of the strongest memories I have of playing this game was in Diamond, and my Infernape, Flori, who I'd gotten through the whole game, I was going through these different gym battles, and I accidentally started with her for the third one. And by accidentally, I mean, she was hanging by a thread, and she was up against the grass gym, but I mean, she had like a 3 HP left, and I was like, you know, I get to start first because she's the fastest, but oh, she's going to die right now. And so I was about to tag out and, you know, switch out to a different character. And Kevin, I believe you told me this. You were watching me, and you were like, no, she's crazy freaking fast. She might be able to get the first hit in. They're all grass types. If she can do this, then she might be able to do some real damage. And she took out 3 of the 4 monsters before the 4th one took her down. And then she went to sleep, and it was sort of like a, yeah, you can go home, brother. It was a thing. It was emotional. I still remember it. Like, yeah. And crucially, that was not the stakes that then if she died, I had to let her go. I can't imagine if the thing is like, if she dies, I have to let her go.
Yeah, so that's what people like about this. The Oak Challenge, which I came across by accident while I was researching this, that sounds like it sucks. I wouldn't do that. Yeah, grinding is not terribly fun in Pokemon. On top of self-imposed challenges within the existing games, some take a more technical approach to customizing their experience. So some people do randomizer challenges, where people use software to mod the game such that it randomizes all the Pokemon encounters and trainer battles, including your starters. And some randomizers on top of that will even reshuffle Pokemon movesets and types, so their usual types won't even be there either. However, others try to break from the games entirely, either modifying an existing game to create entirely new experiences or designing their own Pokemon-inspired original games. And it's these kind of Pokemon-related fan projects that we're going to talk about today. So today, I'm going to introduce you to Pokemon fan projects. We'll talk about their history and the different ways people have tried to put their own signature on the Pokemon series. And after that, we'll then discuss some controversies connected to these types of fan projects. So before we start, is anyone familiar with any kind of fan-created Pokemon games?
I've heard of Pokemon Uranium, and I've heard the name Pokemon Radical Red. So I'm assuming that for every one I've heard of, there's probably 100 I haven't. So I'm going to guess there's 200 of them out there, and I've heard of those 2.
Kate's saying no.
Yeah, I shook my head on a podcast, yeah.
What about you, Phil?
Oh, yeah, no, too many to mention here.
All right, so let's get started then with these, because this is some really fascinating history. Let's first define what we mean when we say a fan project. I'm specifically focusing on grassroots developed games, games that are developed by fans that borrow, repurpose, or otherwise adopt the mechanics and visual style of a commercial video game. In the case of a Pokemon fan project, this involves elements like capturing, training, and battling monsters in the style that replicates a Pokemon game, or utilizes some element of Pokemon-related branding, things like the items, the regions the games take place in, specific characters, and the Pokemon themselves. I also want to make it clear that we're focusing on non-retail games, specifically defining fan projects as Pokemon-inspired games that are specifically designed without a profit motive. The overwhelming majority of people in this community neither seek nor expect any kind of revenue from their games. And I want to make that distinction to separate fan projects from for-profit games that borrow assets, another way of saying stealing assets, like images of Pokemon, to trick unsuspecting people into buying them, thinking that they're actually getting a Pokemon game, like the Pokemon equivalent of a Mockbuster. And for examples of that, I encourage you to check out the iPhone App Store, and you'll find more than a few games, quote-unquote, borrowing some pieces of Pokemon-related IP. It's pretty bad in the mobile scene.
Oh, I would think Nintendo would like to catch them all in a lawsuit.
With that out of the way, buckle up for what I hope will be a fun and interesting look at a whole bunch of unauthorized Pokemon titles you've probably never heard of, combined with some pocket monsters that may have only appeared in your wildest dreams or nightmares. We'll dig into their history, reminisce on some late 90s and early 2000s internet history, try our hand at some intellectual property law, and maybe continue to share some Pokemon-related memories along the way. All right, so there are two types of fan-developed Pokemon game projects. Those are ROM hacks and fan games. ROM hacks involve hacking or modifying a digital copy of a retail Pokemon game, such as Pokemon Red, Pokemon Emerald, or Pokemon Platinum. Fan games, on the other hand, are original games built from the ground up in the style of a mainline Pokemon game. Now, both have their own advantages in terms of what they offer, and both also, interestingly, have their own distinct and interesting histories. With that, let's start with ROM hacks, because they are both the oldest and the most common form of Pokemon fan projects. And to talk about ROM hacks, we need to step back for a minute and briefly talk about ROMs. Is anyone here familiar with ROMs and or emulation? And in asking this question, I'm not asking anyone to incriminate themselves.
I mean, I can speak as a software developer. Software emulators are a way to recreate the experience of a piece of software that is perhaps out of date or no longer available, or maybe you couldn't buy it so you stole it, and you can load it onto a different machine, a different technology, and you can do something with it.
That's a great definition of it. So yeah, that's emulation. And so ROMs, which is short for read-only memory, are digital copies of commercial video games, which are played through emulators, which Kate very succinctly described as programs designed to replicate the hardware of specific computer or game systems. And we'll save a deep dive into emulation for another day. But suffice to say for now, the first widely available emulators came around in the mid to late 1990s. In the case of Pokemon, it's generally believed the first Game Boy emulator was Virtual Game Boy, which came out in 1995, followed by No Cash GMB in 1997. To play games on emulators, people devised methods of transferring data from game cartridges onto a computer in a process known as dumping. Those dumped ROMs could then be played through an emulator and or shared online, which tons upon tons of people did. In addition to converting games into digital files capable of being run in an emulator, some technically inclined people soon found that they could extract the data from the ROMs, including the game's assets, and manipulate them in a variety of interesting ways. This gave rise to ROM hacking. And as an aside, I'll point out that while we're focusing on Pokemon ROM hacks in this episode, ROM hacking is far from exclusive to Pokemon. There are tons of subcultures related to ROM hacking in a variety of games. For example, one of the most famous non-Pokemon ROM hacks is the Mother 3 fan translation project, which was a fully fan-developed English translation and localization of Mother 3 for the Game Boy Advance, released in 2008. As an aside, that game is fantastic. I strongly encourage playing it. There's also a 2018 hack of Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time that replaces Link with Waluigi.
Because we need more nightmares, yeah.
Can I ask a question? So as far as ROM hacking, are they hacking, like, assembly?
Great question. If there was a need to, they could. I can't cite chapter and verse right now, but yeah, you could basically reassemble and recreate the experience of almost any piece of software with emulation. I don't know about ROM hacks so much.
You know, people must be really, really super motivated to accomplish something in these games if you're going to go to the level of like hacking assembly code to accomplish something in them.
It's a tremendous amount of work.
It's like if we were talking about a bank robbery and somebody like bored a hole like underneath a city and up into the bank vaults.
Yeah.
You know, drilled through the bottom. It's like they must have really wanted that. It just occurs to me that people are just super, super, super motivated to do this.
Like there are the people who, you know, on the night of the purge secretly transfer all the funds out of the bank that they work for, and then there's the ROM hackers who, yeah, to your point, Phil, bore up through a hole in the city and, you know, desperately want to get at the money and just kind of grab fistfuls of it and run.
Another interesting project that I came across while researching this topic is Sonic Hellfire Saga, which is a Castlevania and Ghost and Goblins inspired Sonic 3 and Knuckles ROM hack developed by Red Miso Studios, where Sonic goes on an adventure in hell.
Wait, so is that just Sonic 06?
Wow.
I don't know if I would find that fun. I appreciate the effort, but yeah.
If you search your favorite retro game and add the term ROM hack, chances are you'll find a couple. So I encourage you to do some of your own research if that sounds interesting to you. Now, going back to Pokemon, while it's impossible to say who was the first Pokemon ROM hacker, many in the community cite text mods as the earliest types of ROM hacks. So these were projects where people altered the in-game text, so things like item descriptions and NPC dialogue, and the likes of Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow. A few of these texts even claim to be the quote-unquote uncensored versions of of the mainline Pokemon games, allegedly restoring material cut thanks to Nintendo's strict content guidelines. And for a refresher on that, check out our previous episode on the 1993-94 violent video game hearings and the creation of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board.
Wait. Are we about to get into the babalities for Pokemon? Because I might have to leave if that's what's going to happen.
I promise we're not going to do that. In practice, however, many tech stacks just replace the existing script with a whole bunch of obscenities. Case in point, there's Pokemob, begins with a B. Pokemob, a ROM hack of Blue, where the first time your character talks to his mother, she shouts back, quote, "Leave now, I hate you, you were an accident, get the fuck out of my sight now," end quote.
What is it, my birthday? That is a joke. Sorry, go on.
One popular early ROM hack in this vein was Vita Trans Silver, a widely circulated fan translation of Pokemon Silver developed by a group called Vita Translations. Vita Trans Silver appeared on the internet sometime in the months between Pokemon Gold and Silver's November 21st, 1999 debut in Japan and their North American release on October the 15th, 2000. On a personal note, I can say that as a perpetually online, video game obsessed high school sophomore who concerned basically everything Pokemon related that he could get his socially awkward hands on, you better believe I snatched up a copy of Vita Trans Silver to tide me over in the months leading up to the game's official release in the States. And I can say from personal experience, having played through at least the first two gyms through Vita Trans Silver, that I recall it being a pretty decent attempt, at least enough to tide me over until I got a real copy. I wasn't confusing it or substituting it for the real thing. It was just kind of thing to keep my Pokemon fix until I got the real thing. However, it's not without its issues, which I suppose are to be expected given it was probably hastily slapped together in a few weeks. One of the biggest issues, aside from its best questionable legality, is that Japanese kanji words require a lot fewer characters than English, and as a result, every item, move, and Pokemon name are limited to only 5 characters, leaving your imagination to do some heavy lifting to fill in the gaps. For example, the fire starter Cyndaquil only appears as Cinda in the game. Its evolved form Quilava is named Quila, and so on and so forth for every Pokemon in the game. Also, the translators renamed berries, which are items that are found pretty frequently throughout the game, as the less letter-intensive nuts. I also don't know if this was a full translation. I've heard rumor of a gold translation that came out around the same time, which apparently only went up to like the 4th gym, and then just kind of gave up. Because as both Kate and Phil pointed out, this is really labor-intensive.
So when it gave up, did it switch back to the other language, or did the game just stop?
I have not played this. Again, this is only stuff I've read about it online. I think it just went back to Japanese after that. I think that's all they had the wherewithal to do. Another interesting set of early ROM hacks were Pokemon Jade and Pokemon Diamond. That one not to be confused with the actual Pokemon Diamond that came out for the DS in 2006. This Pokemon Diamond, along with its counterpart Pokemon Jade, were actually crude English fan translations of Keitai Denju Telefang, a pair of admittedly interesting sounding Japan-exclusive Game Boy Color games with a similar premise to Pokemon released by Natsume in 2000. Sometime in the early 2000s, one or a group of ROM hackers made crude English translations of the Telefang games and tacked on some Pokemon branding in an attempt to pass them off in the West as unreleased Pokemon games. There are even bootleg cartridges in circulation, with Pokemon Jade having some really janky, generic brand soda-looking cover art, which I'm going to show you right now.
Oh, cool!
Oh, wow, that looks like it could have come out of like Princess Mononoke.
Yeah. Oh, I can totally see that, Andy. Good point.
It just looks really awkward on a Pokemon cover, you know?
Yeah, it does. It's a Miyazaki illustration on Pokemon, which are two distinctly different styles of anime.
During the 2000s, there were numerous ROM hacks of the first 2 generations of Pokemon. However, it was the Game Boy Advance, also known as Gen 3, that ended up having the greatest influence on the Pokemon ROM hacking community. Nintendo brought Pokemon to the Game Boy Advance, with Pokemon Ruby and Pokemon Sapphire, which came out in Japan in 2002, followed by a worldwide release a year later. In 2004, Nintendo put out Game Boy Advance remakes of the Gen 1 titles with Pokemon Fire Red and Pokemon Leaf Green, which adapted the games of the Red, Blue, Green, and Yellow era with the modern engine and Pokédex of Ruby and Sapphire, plus a bunch of extra content. The company then added one last mainline 3rd generation game with Pokemon Emerald, first released in Japan in 2004 and in the West in 2005. The first Game Boy Advance emulators came out in 2000, with the earliest being GBA EMU and Virtual Game Boy Advance, or BGBA, and it didn't didn't take long for Gen 3 ROMs to circulate online. And of all of these games, for whatever reason, Fire Red became a very popular game for ROM hacking, and many ROM hacks have used this game as a basis up through the present day. As to why Fire Red became so popular is not really well understood. Some in the community have speculated someone just really liked the game and decided to make a hack based on it, and their work with Fire Red inspired other people to do the same. Apparently, from a technical standpoint, Fire Red is more stable than Ruby or Sapphire, but no one really knows why Fire Red ended up getting so much love over, say, Leaf Green. Now, this is me speculating, but I suspect the reason why Gen 3 is so popular is that the games after Gen 3 see a lot less ROM hacking, although it's not zero, on account of it being more technically complicated. For example, with DS games, you have to deal with 2 screens. And not even thinking about 3DS emulation or Switch emulation. It's probably on a technical level, again, not a technical expert, probably easier for those earlier games because you don't have to deal with all those extra factors.
That makes sense. Yeah. Also, the DS has, for the second screen, you've got to deal with on a computer, how are you emulating the touch input of the screen? Whereas, for Game Boy Advance, you're only emulating button inputs. So pretty straightforward. Or I would assume more straightforward if you're a technically minded person, which I'm not.
Whatever the impetus, Fire Red ended up as the game with the most tools and technical support in the user community, and there are tons of resources available for the aspiring Fire Red ROM hacker. For example, on September the 10th, 2009, a user called JPan shared a hacked version of the game's engine on the fan project resource site Poke Community, a post that as of this recording has been viewed over 674,000 times. In 2013, another user called Mr. Dollsteak developed a patch for Fire Red that allowed users to integrate battle mechanics, movesets, items, and updated stats from the more recent Pokemon games, allowing people to make Fire Red hacks with more modern amenities like newer moves, mega evolutions, and even the fairy type. In 2018, another user called Professor Leon Diaz released a new battle pack built on Mr. Dollsteak's called the CFRU, which is short for Complete Fire Red Upgrade, which is apparently more stable than Mr. Dollsteak's battle engine. A group of fans even successfully decompiled Fire Red's source code in 2018, followed by Pokemon Emerald, which is another popular game in the ROM hacking community in 2020, and shared both sets of codes on the software hosting service GitHub. The changes users made in these ROM hacks run the gamut. Some tweak gameplay elements to make the games more challenging, such as upping trainer levels or changing the AI so it behaves more like competitive players. Others try to retrofit mechanics from more recent games into older titles, such as Mega Evolutions and Z-Moves. A bunch of projects try to allow the player to catch the entire National Pokédex, again a daunting task because, as I mentioned before, there are now over 1,000 Pokemon. Some supplement or replace the existing Pokédex with entirely original creations, dubbed Fakemon in the community, or even integrate their own original mechanics. And one of my favorite user-generated mechanics I came across is the Pokemon Knife, a 2007 mod of Red that lets you straight up murder NPCs, giving a new meaning to the term stab in Pokemon. Red used knife. It's super effective.
Just for the uninitiated, stab is short for same type attack bonus. For a fire type Pokemon using a fire type move, it deals an extra 50% damage compared to if a non-fire type Pokemon had used that same fire type move.
Okay. If you're talking about min-maxing, you have my attention.
So the most ambitious ROM hacks replace the base game's story with an entirely original one. For example, a bunch try to adapt story beats from other Pokemon media. So case in point, Pokemon Ash Gray, a Fire Red ROM hack developed by a user called Metapod23, allows you to play as Ash Ketchum, the main character of the Pokemon anime, and go through his journey playing through highlights of the show's first season. Several games take place in the Orange Islands, which was another story arc from the anime. Pokemon Adventure Red Chapter, meanwhile, is a Fire Red hack where players go through the Pokemon Adventures manga. There's even Pokemon Team Rocket Edition, another Fire Red ROM hack where you play as a Team Rocket grunt, stealing other trainers' Pokemon as you climb your way up the ranks of the criminal organization. There are actually a couple of ROM hacks that are specifically focused on playing as Team Rocket.
That's such a clever idea. I mean, I can see why the official Pokemon games have never done that, especially when Pokemon first came out and there were people flagging, this is just cute cockfighting. Why they wouldn't want to, give any more ammunition to people saying that the games are promoting any sort of negative values. But it's a fun idea, the same gameplay, except your perspective is, instead of capturing Pokemon from the wild, you're stealing them from, little 8-year-old kids wearing shorts or bug catchers and stuff.
Put that Ash in its place. Some ROM hacks cross Pokemon with other media, using the game as a basis for new adventures where it plays characters from the likes of Dragon Ball Z and One Piece. Now, it's hard to pin down the first ROM hack that tackled an original story. However, one of the most influential early ROM hacks in this vein was Pokemon Brown. Released in 2004, Pokemon Brown was a hack of Pokemon Red developed by Adam Vieira, aka Cool Boy Man. Unlike other ROM hacks of the time, Vieira's game completely ditched Red's story and setting, with Brown taking place in a completely fan-made region that he called Region. I'm not sure if that's how it's pronounced, but it's spelled R-I-J-O-N. So Region, Rajan, whatever. Region. I'm going to go with Region. And some places online cite Pokemon Brown as the first Pokemon ROM hack to involve an entirely original story in a fan-created region. Also, unlike other ROM hacks of the time, Pokemon Brown actually was finished. Because, many fan projects in general end up never getting finished. They're often like people get a lot of energy early on, and then they kind of run out of steam and nothing happens. Pokemon Brown was different because it actually was a finished game when he puts it out in 2004. Cool Boy Man even put out a remake of Pokemon Brown in 2009, and a bunch of aspiring ROM hackers followed in his footsteps and developed their own personal Pokemon adventures. And over the years, ROM hackers have taken Pokemon into some interesting and strange directions. Take, for example, Pokemon Snakewood, a Ruby ROM hack released in 2010 by a user called Cutlerine, who decided to answer a very 2000s question. What if Pokemon, but with zombies? To that end, Cutlerine crafted a narrative of Ruby's Hoenn region overrun by hordes of both undead trainers and Pokemon, the latter bearing such mad magazine as filtered through the Crypt Keeper names as Bulbasaur, Electabugs, and Gorlax.
Well, I don't know what's scarier, those names or Uwe Boll's House of the Dead.
Check out our commentary track.
Yeah.
And then there's Pokemon Clover, a Fire Red ROM hack released in 2020 that was literally designed by 4chan users for 4chan users. Taking place over 2 regions with an entirely fan-created Pokedex boasting 386 Fakemon, Pokemon Clover is an absolute fever dream of 4chan in-jokes and memes. The game also introduces some unique mechanics. For example, the devs put in failsafes, where if the player uses a cheat device to, for example, get infinite Master Balls or infinite rare candies, just before the end of the game's story, the player will be arrested, charged with cheating, and thrown in prison. And if that wasn't bad enough, for good measure, the game will also delete the offending player's save file. Also, in case you were wondering, as befitting what is essentially Pokemon 4chan edition, Pokemon Clover is absolutely lousy with racism, sexism, homophobia, and anti-Semitism. This ain't nothing of a bunch of pro Gamergate shit, adding to our slowly growing list of pro Gamergate games we've covered on this show, joining our old friend Hatred. And for more on that, check out our previous episodes on hatred and destructive creations.
I feel like Gamergate is like the Thanos of this podcast, where it gets referenced in every episode, and then sooner or later, you're like, when is this boss going to show up?
That is such a great comparison, Phil. But I was thinking just in light of, comparing this Pokemon 4chan game to Hatred, it's funny to imagine Alan playing Pokemon. I've got to catch them all.
Can you do I choose you in that voice?
Pikachu, I choose you to die.
Okay, now say Squirtle in that voice.
Squirtle. Also, I'm not your trained monkey, Phil.
It just makes me so happy.
All right.
What luck! I have found an Igglybuff. I shall level it up to be Jigglypuff and destroy you all. Jigglypuff. Jigglypuff. All right, so that will do it for our talk of ROM hacks for now. Any other thoughts on these games?
Yeah, can we take a couple of minutes to talk about ROM hacking itself? So when we talk about ROM, what I understand about the basics is usually a ROM is a piece of hardware that's designed to be written once.
Read-only memory, correct, yes.
Yeah, it's integrated into the physical. It's not like code you can change.
It's not open source, it's not code you can change, it's not like HTML or something. No, it's burned onto a CD-ROM, or it might be on a microchip, or it might be, something else, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. It's like hacking a CD. It's either you have to copy the contents to something where you can change the contents fingerprints on it, or I don't know, you have to use like a laser or something to like change the hardware. I don't know. And then there are a bunch of different stages of code that go from what a programmer writes to what makes it to the ROM, right? There's the source code where a person like me or Kate writes out whatever makes sense to us in a way that we can structure the logic and other people can read it. Variable Pikachu equals new Pokemon or something like that. And then source code goes from source code to compressed code to save on the amount of space that code takes up. Pikachu equals new Pokemon. You could actually rewrite that as 1 or A equals new B, which is much shorter. So those are equivalent statements to whatever compiler is reading that code. But you can see if you're doing stuff like A equals new B or C equals new D, you could fit more of that code on to the ROM. So that's going from source code to compressed code. And then when you go from compressed code to compiled code, that's where it goes from, say, the ASCII format, which is like A, B, C, D, F, G, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and a bunch of symbols to like assembly language, which looks like
I've known precisely one person who actually did assembly by hand, and I don't know who he was trying to impress. Yeah, it looks insane. What were you going to say, Phil?
No, that's exactly what I was saying.
You don't do assembly by hand. I mean, you can, but why would you? You're right on the money. You go to the code, then it gets compressed, and then it gets compiled, and then it turns into assembly, which is basically indecipherable, where you try to edit it by hand.
It looks like the Matrix, except instead of green text on a black screen going down in columns, it's going across in rows.
It's like the Matrix, but they really don't want you to understand. Side note with the Matrix and Phil, just you got me on that tangent. The business where Cypher, I forget the actor's name, says like, now at this point I can just kind of look at this and I can pick out patches of code. It's like, you cannot freaking read assembly. I've been doing this for 10 years. Like, no, you cannot read assembly. I call BS on that. No.
Well, I hope that the context I'm talking about this is what ROM hacking is. I don't know.
It is. No, it is.
Just like on a high level.
Yeah, ROM hacking is that. And then emulation is something that is related but different, because emulation can be done entirely above board and ethically. Like, for instance, Salman Rushdie's, I guess it was his desktop computer at one point, was emulated so that people could go online and basically go pick through all of his early writings. That was all done above board. Some of it, I don't know if it was or wasn't open source, but I've known a lot of emulation tactics that are done open source. Emulation software is pretty tricky, and I don't have a ton of experience in it directly, but you can do it directly as a way to save software and a way to preserve software-based experiences and internet-based experiences also, frankly. But in terms of emulators, now my understanding, I don't play a lot of ROMs. Kevin, you can correct me, or Phil, or anyone. I guess Andy, you're the only one I left out, sorry. I think that you would need an emulator to play a ROM, generally speaking. So you could have an unethical ROM, but play it on an ethical emulator.
So the legality, which we're not going to talk really about today, but I think we'll do a whole episode on emulation because it is really complicated. The short answer is that in terms of legality, at least in the United States, it hasn't really been tested in the courts too much. But the courts seem to concede the idea that emulators are legal so long as the people who developed them did not use any of the proprietary like code or software that the original thing was. If they reverse engineered it on their own, that is considered okay. That's considered above board.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, because like for instance, Rushdie's first computer was a Macintosh, a Mac Performa. Like that's proprietary software, but the emulation software was ethical, was above board. Sorry, go on.
So yes, if they built it on their own without the assistance or usage of any of the original materials, my understanding is that it's considered okay. However, the thornier legal thing comes with emulation is the ROMs themselves. So there's some debate about the legality of ROM hacking in the sense that the U.S. copyright law allows you to have a backup of any software you have for archival purposes, but you have to specifically own that piece of software. And this is kind of where it gets thorny, is technically it's only your copy. Say, we'll use Pokemon as an example. Say I got Pokemon Emeralds. If I've got this cartridge of Pokemon Emerald, then technically under U.S. copyright law, I can have a digital copy of that as a backup for archival purposes. However, the dicier part of it is that it seems like under the law, and again, this hasn't really been tested in the courts, that it's only considered a legal copy if I took that cartridge and I made the copy myself, as opposed to going onto a website where someone is sharing those things. That's where the dicey territory is, because people will argue that you can own a ROM so long as you have the thing, which technically you can, but usually where it comes to is if you made that bad thing. That's actually where Nintendo's stance is. If you download a ROM online, even if you have that original thing, because you didn't make that ROM, that you cannot legally have that. And the other part of it is that it is considered illegal under U.S. copyright law to upload ROMs and share them with other people. That is considered objectively illegal.
Thank you again for that. I do have a question, and it's just popped into my head as you were talking. The famous retro ROMs that the Internet Archive put out, how did that work? Because they're distributing them to the world, and presumably everybody doesn't have those.
I don't know. So right now, the Internet Archive has tons of...
Oh, yeah, no. I'm looking at a link right now, in fact, but go on.
So emulation gets really complicated when it comes to archival and preservation purposes. And the games industry has a terrible history of saving its own things. Basically, game companies will only save things if they feel like they can make money off them.
I'll also point out the Internet Archive, if they're doing something that's quasi-legal or not 100% legal, this wouldn't be the first time that they have been threatened with litigation, for instance.
Yeah, and they could be, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I believe if a copyright holder decided, they could make a legal challenge to them.
Okay, I was just curious because I remember this was a huge payload when it came out on the internet.
Because the other thing is that people still run ROM sites. They're not often challenged, but when they are, and this is something we'll talk about when we talk about the actual controversies around these specific types of ROM hacking and things, is that Nintendo in particular, if they set their legal sites on you, they're going to make a fucking example of you. They will rake you over the coals. They will hit you with everything that they got because they want to scare everybody else. They want to send a message that if you share ROM stuff online, we will burn your fucking house down. And they will occasionally. They don't do it very often, but they will occasionally, every couple of years, Nintendo will lay the hammer down and go at a couple of things. But the challenging thing about that is a lot of times it depends on where these things are being hosted. I know the Internet Archive itself is based in Silicon Valley. I don't know where their servers are based. If their servers are based in a country that doesn't have the kinds of copyright laws and reciprocity laws that the United States has, they can usually get around that.
I will tell you, because they put everything above board.
Well, I mean, another question is some of the systems don't exist anymore. Like, who would sue for somebody who has the rights to those things? And I don't know if anybody does.
That's often the thing, too. And between us, is it's generally a victimless crime. And a lot of that software is like, nobody's making money off of it. No one's making that much money off it. If I went on and got Lester the Unlikely for the Super Nintendo, God knows who's got the rights for that. Nobody cares about that game.
Sorry, if anyone's curious, and I'm only skimming this article, the Petabox, there's a 100 terabyte rack in Amsterdam as of 2004 and an 80 terabyte rack in San Francisco, which is where the rest of them are based.
Okay, so it's possible they have some of them there. I don't know what the copyright law is.
And you're right. The reason I'm belaboring that point is you're right, is crucially where it's situated is what you have the right to do with it.
And the legal challenges tend to boil down to where the jurisdictions are. So if the servers were like in Ukraine, they're probably not going to be able to go after them as easily as they would in like Great Britain or the US. And then it's also, where's the domain hosters based? So whoever's hosting the website that runs it, where are they based? Because sometimes what they'll do, like the Nintendo sometimes will do a copyright strike at the domain host, do what's called a DMCA strike or Digital Millennium Copyright Act strike, and they'll go for them and they'll shut it down basically. And sometimes they will go directly to the people making it, but it largely depends on where they are. Again, if it's someone like, for example, in like, New Jersey versus like someone in Singapore, they may go for that, or versus like Hong Kong. China is very famously very, very loose copyright laws, and it's very, very hard to put any kind of legal challenge on things. So like if they're based in Beijing, Nintendo can't do very much about that, Do we want to make any other points about this?
Yeah, can I bring up a few other things about how unbelievably difficult I personally think it is to accomplish ROM hacks? So like when you have like a PS4, there could be a ROM on that system, and Kate, please jump in at any of these points. There could be a ROM on that system that has like the rendering engine. It's the thing that takes your game and turns it into the thing we play. And there could also be a ROM for the game cartridge, something that was written once and can't be written again, or like a CD. ROM is a ROM because you can only write to it once, or most CDs you can only write to once. So like, how are we going to change this game? We could, I don't know, use a laser, because like a ROM is like a headstone. It's like carved in there. So if you want to change the game, you could use a chisel to change very minute. You could change an I into an E, or you could change an I into a T by like carving the top. Or you could copy the game engine ROM and you could copy the game ROM and move them to a PC where you can edit any of those things freely. You need a harness to surround the game engine that will get the game engine to work. And then you need
Yeah, a
probably
decompiler is what you're talking about, right?
Okay, exactly. So if those things are written in assembly, there could be something that reverse compiles that assembly into the compressed code.
Yeah.
But you would need to know, like it goes from, 00100101 to.
So I think what you're talking about is like decompilation. Again, a decompiler. It takes the compressed code, turns it back into the base code. It's never an exact science. You're not turning it back into the true source code. You're turning it into an equivalent code. And that's why
Right.
you get all jacked sometimes with ROMs.
So you would need people in the community where everybody is staring at the compressed code and being like, which one of these is the variable for Waluigi?
Yeah.
Which of these things is
Yes.
this level? And then people would just have to share that information online.
Which, to Kevin's point, is why community-based ROMs are much better than like one person in their basement did it themselves.
Okay, so this is a thing where everybody will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This
It's
is
like,
how
hey,
this
I think I figured out. I think I isolated the variable for Waluigi's
Oh.
hat or whatever. Yeah, exactly.
This is how this community's run for so long.
Oh,
So it sounds like it's a manually reconstructed.
The way that decompiler software works is it does its best to decompile compiled code and turn it back into what it was before it was compressed and compiled.
But then
Yeah.
if the community manually figured out what each variable in the compressed code meant, they could attempt to manually rebuild.
Sure, and I mean, if the equivalency code is near enough to the source code, then you don't need a community, you could just do it yourself. But the
Right.
whole thing is like, yeah, when really quality ROMs are out there, it's because there's a community around it. So it's like, hey, I stared at this and I thought that this variable meant that thing, and I changed it, and it mostly worked except Waluigi's, head came off, and then I don't know how to fix it. But if you're the only one doing it, then you don't know how to fix it. But if you've got other people helping you, then you can actually make it all really much more robust. And then frankly, like when you get a community of developers who do this for a living legally, who get their heads around a code base that they've not developed but they have to maintain, then everybody can start to understand it and share that knowledge. And you can not just make emulations, but maybe then make bonus games, like bonus game. What am I trying to say? Fan-made games. That's what I was trying to say. Sorry.
A lot of what we're going to say in this community is that it's very active. It's been active for a long time, and it's a lot of people looking at this kind of stuff and trying to see how they can make their own games out of it. I mean, it's a lot of people looking at it.
Yeah, but still, you have to love the shit out of this game to do. You could not pay me like enough money to do so fucking hard.
Not everyone has cable. A lot of people have a lot of time on their hands. If I'm totally derailing here, but you can just tell me.
No, this is great. I love that we've got two people who actually have the technical stuff, because this is all Greek to me. I don't know.
I'm really enjoying. This is one of the most enjoyable conversations I've ever had on this podcast, because we're all like collaborating and figuring stuff out in real time. That's what it feels like anyway.
And we're going to make a Scandalous Games Pokemon ROM hack at the end of this, right?
In our copious free time.
We're going to make a Philemon and an Andymon, a Kevinmon. Yeah.
Ooh, so I guess the bad guys of like a Scandalous Games ROM hack would be
The establishment.
No, I was trying to think. I've already forgotten the name of the makers. Oh, Destructive Creations, maybe. And the hardest gym leader would be Jack Thompson. Or maybe Jack Thompson would be the like annoying rival, like the Gary or the Blue. You get the chance to just beat him over and over again.
Smell you later, loser. I'll sue you.
Well, I mean, I never answered the door anyway, so good luck subpoenaing me.
Seeing some of this code is a helpful reminder to me that when I or any other entitled fan on the internet is like, why can't Game Freak just do XYZ? It's like, well, under the hood, there's a fair amount of stuff going on.
Yeah, and I mean, I can't speak. I'm sure we could trawl through this code base and look at every last modicum. I'm sure the internet will let me know if I'm speaking out of turn. But like with the equivalency code, if you're looking at, you might be able to, say, replace a method with a different method and rename it where it's being used. But at a much lower level, when you have replaced that method or, put a new one in, and you're copy pasting other code and modifying it, you might not know about a lot of the other dependencies underneath that. Frankly, even open source code where I can see everything at its original source, if I just go in and start hacking at stuff, I can do a lot of damage and things are not going to work the way that I expect. And I think that's kind of where we get at with ROMs.
And that does end up happening when people develop ROMs. When people generally put out a ROM hack, what they'll generally do is they won't announce it to the world build as a finished thing. Usually what they'll do is they'll go to places like Poke Community. Poke Community is a website where a lot of people interact with these things. Or they'll go to a number of different...
It's in beta, can't get mad. It's in beta, can't get mad.
Yeah, so basically what they'll do is they'll crowdsource the debugging. So they'll put it out, here's what I have, here's its current builds, play through here, let me know what issues you have on it, and they kind of work on it together. And like, I mentioned Pokemon Snakewood, and this person, Cutlery, was working on that. And Cutlery, when they were first developing Pokemon Snakewood, they went to Poke Community, and they basically said, here's the game, try it out, download it. Because what people do, something I haven't talked about is how do they get these things to run, is they need to have a ROM of the original game. They would have to have that specific file that would run in a Game Boy Advance emulator. They then put through a patching program, which basically takes the hacked material they have and combines it with the original ROM and makes it into a playable game they can play in an emulator. And so what a person like Cutlery would do is, here's the hack, and leave it up to people to find the ROM, because at Violet's community guidelines to share a ROM. People would patch it themselves, they would play through it, and they'd say, okay, here are the issues I'm having with it, and the community would kind of fix it together, either identifying to the original developer the problems with it, or the person developing would go to the community and say, these are the problems I keep having with this code. Because again, it's a lot of things scaffolded on top of each other. It's like you're building a house and you want to build a whole new extension on this house when you don't know how to do that. So you've tacked on an extra room on the second floor and it's made of like tape and balsa wood, and the whole thing could fall apart at any moment because it's not really built for that. And so it's a lot of people.
And yet, if you had a bunch of volunteer contractors and each contractor was willing to put one nail in, eventually...
And they were super invested in this being the greatest structure.
Exactly. That's what's going on in this, and so much of this community is a collaborative process. We'll see that in the next episode when we cover fan games, which is for both of these types of communities, it is extremely collaborative, and it's a lot about like, here's what I'm doing, and how do I fix it? How I make game run.
Maybe not so much how I make game run, but that can sometimes be the problem. It can sometimes be, this sequence in particular was very special to me, and so I'm trying to make it as good as possible. And like, you know, the coloration on the hood of the car that if I move it, there's Mewtwo under it or whatever, needs to be right. Someone help me. And that's where you can get some really targeted advice within the community.
So let me pitch you this, Kate, and I don't know if it exists, but you know, when people are talking about AI, you know, artificial intelligence and machine learning and, you know, Chat GPT, which is a language model. So like, what are use cases where the technology that exists now, this is a good use for that, and where is it, a bad use? So there are lots of bad uses, and you might know where I'm going with this, Kate. I think you can take a utility and reverse compile the assembly code into the compressed code, right? But you need logic. You need a set of directions. You need a map or advice or something human readable to tell you what equals what, right? And I think that if you fed in, like as training sets to a machine learning algorithm, other code that a community has lovingly reverse compiled and information about the game that you're trying to reverse compile the code into, I think a machine learning algorithm could learn that stuff and make a pretty good guess about what A is supposed to be. A is supposed to be Jigglypuff.
Jigglytough. Not Jigglypuff.
Jigglypuff.
But no, it's Jigglypuff. If we're doing it with AI would probably say Jigglytough. Anyway, please finish your point, because yes, I do have some thoughts on this, but I'm interested in what you have to say.
So yeah, it knows what the logic is, and it knows what it should do and what it can't do. It's just going to guess at what the names should be. Like, okay, do you think that would be a good use case?
Maybe. So the thing I was going to mention is, and I'm not going to get too specific about my professional background, but something that came to my attention recently was ChatGPT citations for scholarly research and research papers that can bolster physics and mathematics, among other things. So I just posted in the chat this book that we're looking at on Amazon right now called Mathematics for Physicians. My understanding is this book was written by AI and it's gibberish. And more than a few folks in my line of work have come across it as if it was intended to be a piece of authoritative research, which is alarming to say the least. Because basically, it seems like AI knows just enough to be dangerous. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's like you could kind of glance at this and think it's right.
Sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but I noticed that there was one review. It's just literally auto-generated nonsense.
I mean, I'm glad that this is a happy thing, but it's scary to me how far this has gotten where people think it's a real book and it's not. And then it can also be cited. You know what I mean? Like So I guess I'm veering off from the answer to the question that you were actually asking, Phil. I see AI and what's powering ChatGPT and something similar as actually poised to do some damage because it looks legit until you barely scratch the surface. And again, knowing just enough to be dangerous. And by dangerous, I mean look legitimate, but not be. And then actually, when you go to it for authoritative information, it's not good. Granted, when you're playing a video game versus consulting a scholarly resource, the stakes are a bit lower. If you play the game and it doesn't work right, that's a bummer. But if you're consulting what appears to be an authoritative academic resource, you could really skew your own research that has an impact on many other researchers in years to come. But yeah, I don't know. I'm just kind of freaked out by all of this, and I'm scared now. And were we talking about Pokemon, or am I thinking of a different episode?
God damn it, it always goes to dystopia, doesn't it?
This was going to be the light episode, right, Kev? Didn't you say? You promised me. You promised me!
Why don't we wrap up some final thoughts about ROM hacking, and then next time we'll focus more on a different version of this in fan game development. So let's go around the room and get some final thoughts about ROM hacking.
Okay, well, I'll go first. If people are willing to go to this extent to do this stuff, people just must love the shit out of Pokemon.
Yeah, it was really interesting for me to learn about what goes into ROM hackings because, originally I, being basically a layperson, thought it was like, oh, well, you have some kind of machine that you put your Game Boy Advance cartridge in, and it spits out the code in easy to edit text file, and so you can just, so learning about everything that does go into it. Even though I haven't played fan games myself, I have a million times more respect for what goes into it, and I feel extra bad for the people who I feel like we'll be meeting or hearing about in an episode or two, and I assume we will eventually hear about takedown notices for all the work that then has to be dismantled.
Yeah, I feel similar. Having even some understanding of, as a developer, knowing how much labor goes into code, even very straightforward code. ROM hacks are not straightforward. They did it because they cared, and they're not doing it because they're trying to make $1 million. They're doing it because they're trying to put that experience back out there because it's no longer available to everyone. And I think that that's really where, there's a groundswell in the community for ROM hacks. Again, they're not doing this because they're trying to create bootlegs and sell them and make lots of money. Typically, and I mean, I'm sure those exist too, but the ones that I am aware of and really identify with are the ones where people make these ROM hacks because it's you can't play this game anymore otherwise. And who among us does not have a very fond memory of playing this or that game? And all I want to do is play this game. And that's what ROMs are supposed to do. The physical technology that this proprietary software was placed on originally is never built to last. But these experiences, these are real, meaningful experiences that we want to share and spread across generations. And that's the point of ROMs, right? Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And I think that it's a question of preservation. And we'll dive into this topic in particular later on in an episode specifically on emulation. But I think that bringing your point, Phil, and your point, Kate, this idea of the passion of this community, they're not doing this for the money. They definitely do this because they really like Pokemon. They like keeping the series going, and they like taking it in exciting and different and creative directions. And we'll talk a bit more about some more of the motivations behind them. But yeah, you cannot doubt someone's dedication when they're able to dive through as much source code and as a non-technical person.
You're making me nervous. I'm sorry. I mentioned that I'm a software developer. I've talked a lot about emulation and ROM and what that means to me. I've never done this. I've never done anything illegal. All of this is satire. Nobody sue me.
I, on the other hand, as I've said before, am
how many laws have you broken, Andy?
Offering legal advice. So everything I've said on this podcast, go ahead, use it in court. Tell them I sent you.
I'll sign it in front of a judge. Yeah.
And by the way, just to tag on to both of those, before today, I didn't even know what the fuck ROM hacking was. So, don't take whatever I said.
Phil, I should have taken that tack. I don't know what it is, but here it is.
Wait, ROM hack, is that the name of a Pokemon? Wink,
wink. Wink.
I think ROM hack was the nickname of Mitt Romney's speechwriter.
Hi-yo.
So with that, next time, we're going to pivot into the other type of these fan projects. We're going to go from ROM hacks to talk specifically about fan games, and then we'll also dive into a little bit more what things are going through people's head when they make these things, and the other big question, are these legal? And that will then segue into when we talk in detail about 2 projects in particular. So that will do it for today's episode of Scandalous Games. If you like what we're doing and want to help the show, subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. If you want to learn more, check out our website, scandalousgamespodcast.wordpress.com, where I publish the show notes and the sources for every episode. Our theme music is Aqua Seek Me by Seek Knowledge via the free music archive. Use under a CC BY NCSA 3.0 US license. If you have a question, comment, or idea for a topic for a future episode, email us at scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Kevin Impellizeri.
I'm Phil Thomas.
I'm Andy Hunter.
I'm Kate.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next Scandal. Subscribe to Fat Roll Gaming on YouTube.